Good morning. How is everyone today? I am so pumped to be able to come up here after the wonderful speakers that preceded me. As the person who introduced me shared, I have a son who is on the spectrum as well, and I'm just blown away by the Lieutenant Governor's comments about really figuring out data across sectors for health and really a medical home for families that are affected by developmental delays and other chronic diseases that last a lifetime. You know, he mentioned 80% of children on the spectrum grow up and never really become engaged in society, and it's just such a horrible thing to imagine that 1 in 68 kids being born today will essentially end up with a lifetime prison sentence because we don't know how to engage with them. And I think it's an obligation that I picked up to try and do the best I can to sort of address that demand. You know, so it's just very, very inspiring to be able to follow, and I hope that I can share some things that also motivate you and help share some of the direction that we might be able to support the ONC in realizing sort of that ambition of making data more liquid and more accessible by consumers so that the consumer can use that in their medical home as they pursue appropriate interventions through state programs and so forth. Just a huge, huge opportunity. And so is the Internet of Things. And trying to transition to the Internet of Things, I did a little research on what it means, the Internet of Things. It's a marketing term that just seems like a lot of hype, but it's sort of staggering when you think about the size of this opportunity that we're seeing. And it's only 3 years from now that people are predicting that there will be 30 billion sensors connected to the network. And how will that affect our health in the future? And how will it affect just, you know, in my space around children on the spectrum, how do we help prevent elopement and, you know, unintentional drownings and all these other opportunities that we'll have around care? But it's such a big space, you know, 50 trillion gigabytes of data. And you add in genomics data, it becomes, you know, that's a fraction of what we'll have in 2020, which is less than 3 years from now. So for me, you know, I try to bring it down just into the things that are directly attributed to healthcare, and the model that I kind of envision in how to make this something that my brain can get around is the idea of health information exchange between clinical sources, covered entities, and non-covered entities along the top. And then there's other data sources, including medical devices, clinical medical devices on the left, and wearables, consumer medical devices. And still that is such a big problem that, you know, as a small not-for-profit, NATE tries to focus and apply our resources on very limited things. So I'll be sharing a little bit about the things that we've focused on in 2016, 2017, 2018. We're really very fortunate to have Leslie Kelly Hall with us today, who has spent a lot of time working with Federal Advisory Committee and others to form recommendations on how to prioritize the next step in interoperability standards with the Interoperability Standards Advisory related to consumer health information sharing. The other thing that's really, really becoming more and more important that I think is incredibly powerful is patient-generated health data. In the autism world, we've always focused on PGHD because parents are the ones that observe most of the behaviors that we're trying to treat. But you know, this recent report published June 4th about the ability to improve survival rates. I used to work for the NCI. Changing survival rates, we would spend millions and tens of millions of dollars to do research on drugs that could modify that by a week for some late-stage cancers. This research showed that by enabling consumers to more interactively share their symptoms, they were able to extend life by 5 months. I remember celebrating that we extended life by 5 days, by 5 weeks, but 5 months by just being more agile in how we communicate our symptoms and our own observations. So there's this ton of different data sources. One of the most valuable ones we haven't even used very effectively in the past, coming from the consumer themselves. And it becomes a question of how do we manage all of those data sources? And I was really excited to see someone from HHS really talking about what Nate's been talking about for a long time, and a lot of organizations have been talking about it for a long time. Dr. Fleming is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health Technology Reform appointed by the Trump administration. And his vision, I believe every American should have a single unified electronic health record system that resides in the cloud and is under full control of the patient, of the individual, of the American, really echoes what I think the Lieutenant Governor was talking about when he talked about having a medical home, where the consumer is in control of that data. And as they move from state to state and from job to job within Michigan, that data following the consumer so that it can follow their care delivery team as they move is going to be critically valuable. So just coming back to where Nate's focused, along the top of this particular image where we're talking about the personal health data ecosystem, we've really divided and conquered the notion of how do we get an individual a populated longitudinal health record by answering 3 questions. The first question is, what information can I get? And I think it's probably very familiar with a lot of folks in the room, but I also think that there's some questions about what are the individual's right of access. And fortunately, we've gotten a lot of progress from our friends at the Office of the Civil Rights. And there's a number of activities going on where we're trying to educate consumers about their right to access and have a copy of their health information. And I frequently hear these kind of comments from folks about how difficult it is and the workflow problems, and that's part of what we're proposing to fix. I was talking with a friend of mine on one of the federal agencies. Are they paying attention to this? Some of this is vendor activity that's intentional. And she said, hey, pay it just in a couple of weeks, there's going to be a big announcement. So I'm really happy to see the federal agencies getting more and more involved in enforcing consumer access, enforcing fair information practices. And I think it's this particular fine that was announced related to our friends at ECW that she was talking about. The other question is, how do I get my data? If you're a consumer, or if you're a navigator working with a family affected by autism, how do we really get to the point where we can retrieve their data and bring it into a longitudinal health record controlled by the consumer? And that's part of the work that we're doing on what we call the Nate Blue Button directory. A use case specific directory to make consumer access methods discoverable. So when we sit with families that have, gotten the confirmation diagnosis that their child has autism, they've typically seen 5 or 6 other providers. And I need that information related to those events to help qualify them for services. There's a number of rule-out things that we have to have done in order for them to qualify for other services. Historically, we've spent 6 weeks trying to retrieve those records in the paper-based world. And really what we're trying to push on is how do we make that more timely? As many people know, I'm sure you all know, every week when a child's 2 years old to 3 years old really affects the outcomes when the brain is most plastic. So my IT experience of spending 30 minutes for a retrieval, well, today we're spending 6 weeks waiting for paper to come back. So even just looking at replacing fax machines with the direct protocol would accelerate how quickly we can get that data in place and how quickly we can get that kid into the appropriate care. So we've been working on a prototype called the Nate Blue Button directory. And it actually very interestingly ties into Genevieve's comments about making this work within the workflow of the provider organization. So a number of years we've been trying to use different mechanisms to retrieve data from provider organizations, but if it didn't fit into their workflow, it might have been even worse than trying to use a fax machine. Because I send a request, my individual right of access, send me my data, send it to the wrong guy, like the guy who's treating me, who doesn't have the responsibility to respond. He'll forward it to someone else and forward it to someone else. Experience on some of the PPRN, patient-powered research networks that I collaborate with is up to 50% of the time, no response at all. So you end up making calls to the practice and going back to fax, getting the fax now another week later than the 6 weeks it took in the first place. So we've developed, with work collaboration with AHIMA, this concept of a blue button directory, a directory that allows provider organizations to communicate, these are the methods that we support today for you to get your health information. And today people are crawl, walk, run. Give me your fax number and tell me that's all you do, and I won't spend a week trying to find out if you respond to direct messages. If you have a patient portal, share that with me. Share with me how do I create that patient portal for the family that I'm trying to help, so that I don't have to send them back to your practice, and consume administrative staff time to do that, so on and so forth. So probably the most important part of this is to work with provider organizations to populate a directory so that consumers can perform searches on the particular organization's methods of sharing information with consumers. For example, here's, within the FHIR resource, which my friend Dr. Rim Cawthron will be talking about on Friday, we have the ability to support publication of the URI for a patient portal. So we're not trying to solve the problem with one tool, but all tools. If there's a patient portal that can help me get the data that I need, fantastic. If not, do you support other mechanisms for me to retrieve data? Can I get the data via direct message protocol? Can I get the data via APIs? And this notion of the fact that you have consumer-facing APIs isn't sufficient, but we have to figure out how to make that even more facile, which is sort of the second area that we've prioritized our work on, is how do I better manage collecting and sharing my data? And that's a big part of the promise of the world of APIs, RESTful APIs, the FHIR universe. We've put together a prototype and some models that we're working with a number of organizations to turn into a connect-a-thon at HL7's meeting in September around the notion of something we've branded as the trust harbor. And the notion of the trust harbor is that for a given consumer-controlled app, any number of endorsements by registered endorsers could be applied and made discoverable so that we can computationally determine whether or not to trust a particular app for a given transaction or use case. So a prototype has been developed, and the model is really quite simple, using some of the latest technologies around JOTs and Java web tokens and so forth, making it discoverable so that a data holder can verify that a consumer app that's trying to access data through an API meets or exceeds a certain level of evaluation criteria and a policy enforcement point, which is all really fun stuff that we hope to share with you on Friday when Dr. Cawthron comes. But before we can get to that point, I think it's really important to find out from our friend Leslie Kelly Hall all of the things that they help prioritize working with the FACAS and others.